You've just moved into your dream home, a place that finally feels like it's yours, a fresh start for you and your family. The stress of moving is behind you, and now you can begin to settle into the peaceful life you've always wanted. But then, something happens, something that shakes you to your core, turning everything upside down in an instant. That's exactly what happened to a family, just like yours, who thought they had found their forever home, only to find themselves in the middle of a nightmare. It all began when a woman who lived next door made it her mission to target this family. Her problem: the color of their skin. She couldn't stand the fact that a black family had moved into the neighborhood, and she was determined to do something about it. No one ever expects to face such outright racism in their own home, but this woman wasn't going to stop. She launched a relentless campaign to get the family evicted, spreading lies, making accusations, and doing everything she could to make their lives miserable. At first, the family was confused. Why would anyone be so hateful, so determined to destroy their happiness? They didn't know how to fight back. They thought the best way to handle things was to ignore it, hoping it would go away. But the woman wasn't backing down. She was persistent, showing up at the landlord's office with complaints that were clearly false. She even went so far as to fabricate stories about the family's behavior, all in an attempt to turn the landlord against them. The tension grew as the woman's lies began to spread. The landlord, who had been friendly and supportive when the family first moved in, now seemed distant. He started asking questions about things that had never been a problem before. The family felt their world closing in around them. They had followed all the rules, paid their rent on time, and had never caused any trouble. But suddenly, they were fighting to keep their home, facing an enemy they couldn't even see: the malicious rumors planted by the woman next door. Just when it seemed like the family was losing the battle, something happened that no one saw coming. The landlord, the very person who was supposed to hold the power in this situation, did something that shocked everyone involved. Instead of siding with the woman who had been so vocal in her attempts to have the family evicted, he took a stand. What he did next left the woman speechless and turned the whole situation upside down. This wasn't just about a family fighting for their right to live in peace. This was about standing up to hate, about choosing what's right over what's easy, and about showing the world that kindness, justice, and integrity can still prevail, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. But the story doesn't end there. The landlord's unexpected actions set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. It wasn't just about a battle between one woman and a family anymore. It was about a community coming together, about people finding their voice, and about showing that racism, no matter how subtle or overt, can never be allowed to win. How did the landlord manage to stand up to this woman? What happened next? And how did this entire experience change the family's life forever? You'll want to stay tuned because the story is far from over, and what happens next is something you won't believe. As the family sat in their living room that night, the weight of the situation seemed unbearable. They had always believed that a new home would be a fresh start, a place where they could finally feel at peace. But now, everything had changed. Their peaceful sanctuary had turned into a battleground, one they never expected to be fighting. And the worst part was that they were fighting against something that was invisible: prejudice, racism, and fear, things they couldn't see, but could feel every time the woman made a new accusation. The family had tried everything to stay calm. They kept to themselves, stayed out of the way, and made sure that there was no reason for anyone to complain. They kept the noise down, respected the neighbors, and worked hard to make sure that they were good tenants. But no matter what they did, it wasn't enough. The woman next door wasn't going to let it go. It wasn't about the noise or the cleanliness of the property. It was about something much deeper: her inability to accept them for who they were. At first, the landlord seemed like a reasonable man. He had been kind when the family moved in, welcoming them with open arms and making sure everything was in order. He had even gone out of his way to introduce himself, offering his number in case they needed anything. In those early days, everything felt perfect. But now, things were starting to shift. The phone calls from the woman were becoming more frequent. She'd show up unannounced at the landlord's office, talking about things that had never been an issue before. Small things, like the family's car being parked too close to the driveway, or a few toys left in the yard. Minor issues that were blown out of proportion, all in an attempt to paint the family as difficult tenants. Despite the obvious lack of evidence, the landlord had started to change. His demeanor was different, colder. He had started asking questions about the family's behavior, which only made them feel more isolated and under scrutiny. They didn't know what to do. They had never experienced anything like this before. The idea that someone could try so hard to make their lives miserable simply because of their race was a bitter pill to swallow. The family's young children noticed the tension too. Their once carefree laughter had been replaced by silence, as they grew more aware of the strain their parents were under. It broke the parents' hearts to see their children suffer from something that they couldn't control, but all they could do was assure them that everything would be okay. It was a tough pill to swallow, knowing that no matter how hard they tried, their good intentions seemed to fall on deaf ears. The turning point came when the woman filed a formal complaint. She accused the family of creating a disturbance, something that had never even occurred. She claimed that the family was constantly fighting, that there was noise at all hours of the night, and that their behavior was making the neighborhood unsafe. The landlord, who had always been approachable, suddenly began to take her side. The family felt blindsided. They had worked so hard to be good tenants, and now it seemed like their dream was slipping away. But just as things were starting to look hopeless, something unexpected happened. The landlord, who had previously seemed to be wavering under the pressure, finally made a decision. The family had no idea what was coming, but they were about to find out just how powerful a single act of integrity could be. One afternoon, the landlord called the family into his office. The tension in the air was thick, and the family knew this could be the moment that decided their fate. The landlord was sitting behind his desk, looking down at the papers in front of him, not saying a word. The family sat quietly, anxiously waiting for him to speak. They had prepared themselves for the worst. A notice of eviction, perhaps even an explanation of how they had violated some rule they didn't even know about. But then, to their surprise, the landlord stood up. "Look," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening, and I want to make something clear. You don't deserve any of this. What's been happening here, with the complaints and accusations, it's not right, and I won't stand for it." The family exchanged confused looks. What was happening? Was this the moment they were about to lose their home, or was something else unfolding? "You see," the landlord continued, "I've been listening to both sides, but I've also been watching what's been happening. And the truth is, I can't ignore it anymore. What you're dealing with isn't just a neighbor with a problem. It's something much bigger than that, and I'm not going to let it go on any longer." The family was stunned. They didn't know what to say. They had expected an apology, or maybe some kind of acknowledgement, but this was something else entirely. It was like the landlord was finally seeing the truth for what it was. "I'm going to make a call," the landlord said. "I want you to stay calm and trust that I'm going to handle this." The family sat in silence as he left the room. Their hearts were racing. They didn't know what was happening or what would come next. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. It was a battle that was far from over, and it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger. As the family sat in that room, the uncertainty hung over them. They knew that the landlord had just made a bold statement, but what would it mean? What was he about to do? Would it be enough to stop the woman's relentless attacks, or was this just the beginning of a much bigger struggle? Time seemed to move slower as the minutes ticked by. The landlord was taking longer than expected. The family began to grow nervous, their thoughts swirling with doubt. Had they misunderstood what he had said? Was there still hope? Or was this just a momentary attempt to placate them before the inevitable happened? Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the landlord returned. He didn't say a word at first, just walked in with the phone in his hand. He held it out to the family, his expression serious but calm. "It's her," he said. "The woman. I called her and confronted her. I've heard her side. And now it's time for you to hear it. She'll be here soon." The family exchanged uneasy glances. What was happening? What had the landlord said to her? The answer to those questions would soon become clear, but they didn't know just how much it would change everything. The doorbell rang, and the family froze. They could feel their hearts pounding in their chests, as if they were about to face their greatest adversary. Would the landlord's actions have the desired effect, or had he unknowingly made things worse? And most importantly, what would happen when the woman walked through that door? The suspense was unbearable. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, cutting through the tense silence in the room. The family sat frozen, the sound echoing in their ears. Their hearts raced in unison, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty. The landlord, standing just a few feet away, looked at them for a moment, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and something else. Was it regret, perhaps? He seemed to hesitate, his hand still holding the phone, as though weighing what would happen next. "Stay calm," he said quietly, though the words did little to ease the tension in the room. He nodded towards the door. "It's time." The family exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves fraying with each passing second. They had no idea what was going to happen when that door opened. Would the woman walk in, ready to continue her barrage of accusations, determined to get them out of the home they had worked so hard to get? Or would the landlord's actions have turned the tide, making her realize that her hate-filled campaign was finally coming to an end? The door creaked open, and there she was, the woman who had caused so much trouble for them, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, a cold look in her eyes. She didn't say a word at first, just stood there, surveying the room with an expression that could freeze anyone in their tracks. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The family, still on edge, waited for the first words to break the silence, unsure of what would come next. Finally, the landlord spoke. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "We need to talk," he said, his eyes locked onto hers. "You've made your complaints, but now I need to hear the truth, and I need you to listen." The woman's gaze shifted from the landlord to the family, and then back to him. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but she said nothing. She wasn't used to being challenged. She had always gotten what she wanted, and she was used to people backing down. But this time, things were different. "I've heard your side of the story," the landlord continued, his tone steady. "And now it's time for the family to share theirs. I need you to be honest with me. No more lies, no more exaggerations." There was a sharp pause before she finally spoke. Her voice was clipped, laced with anger. "I'm not the one lying here," she snapped. "I've seen what's going on in this house. They're troublemakers, and I'm not the only one who's noticed it. You have to do something about it before they ruin this entire neighborhood." The family felt a knot tighten in their stomachs. The woman's words felt like daggers, aimed straight at them. They had worked so hard to fit in, to be respectful neighbors, to make this place their home. Yet here she was, accusing them of things they had never done. But the landlord didn't flinch. He took a deep breath and leaned forward. "You're accusing them of things that aren't true," he said calmly. "I've looked into it, and there's no evidence to support your claims. And from what I've observed, they've been nothing but good tenants." The woman's face flushed with rage, her eyes narrowing. She took a step forward, her voice rising. "You're not listening to me. I know what I saw. I know what's been happening. You can't just let them get away with it." The landlord stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "I've already made up my mind. Your complaints aren't enough to evict this family. In fact, I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you." He turned to the family, his eyes softening just slightly. "They're staying here. You, on the other hand." He trailed off, glancing back at the woman. The air grew even thicker, the tension so palpable that it felt like it could snap at any moment. The family couldn't believe their ears. Was this really happening? Had the landlord just stood up for them, finally choosing to see through the lies? The woman's expression twisted with fury. "You're making a mistake," she spat. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." She took a step back, clearly seething, but the landlord didn't budge. "You've crossed a line," he said firmly. "Your actions, your hatred, are not welcome here. I'm done listening to you." For a brief moment, the woman seemed taken aback. She wasn't used to people standing up to her. But the shock quickly faded, replaced by something darker, something even more dangerous. The venom in her eyes was unmistakable as she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, her words lingering in the air like a toxic cloud. "I'll make sure you regret this," she called over her shoulder, her voice filled with bitterness. "This isn't over." The door slammed shut behind her, and the room fell silent once again. The family could hardly process what had just happened. Had they really won, or had the landlord's decision only stirred up something far more dangerous? The landlord let out a long sigh and turned toward the family. "I know that wasn't easy," he said quietly, his face somber. "But I had to do what was right. No one deserves to be treated like that. Not you, not anyone." The family was still in shock, trying to piece together the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. It felt like a strange dream, something they could hardly believe. They had fought so hard to keep their home, to keep their family safe, and now, for the first time in weeks, they could finally breathe. But even as they felt the smallest sense of relief, a heavy weight hung in the air. The woman had left, but her words, her threats, lingered. Was this really the end of it? Or had the landlord's bold actions only ignited a fire that would only grow hotter? The landlord stood there, his face betraying a deep understanding of the danger they were all facing. "I won't let her get away with this," he promised. "You don't need to worry. I'm going to make sure she can't cause any more problems for you." The family nodded, grateful for his support, but still uncertain. They didn't know what would happen next, but they had a feeling that the worst was far from over. It felt like the calm before the storm. The landlord turned to leave, but before he could open the door, he paused. "One more thing," he said, his voice lowering. "You're not alone in this. The neighborhood's starting to notice what's been going on. People are talking." As the door clicked shut behind him, the family was left to process what had just happened. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had won this round, but the woman was still out there, and her hatred was still brewing. The real test had only just begun. The family sat in the quiet aftermath, each of them processing the sudden shift in their situation. The landlord had just promised that the woman would no longer be a problem. And although they were thankful, something about his words didn't sit right with them. They knew the woman wasn't the type to back down easily, and her last words, those threats of revenge, still echoed in their minds. She had stormed off, but that didn't mean she was gone for good. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet. The family tried to resume their normal routine, but the unease remained like a shadow hovering just out of sight. Every knock on the door, every unexpected car in the driveway, made them jump, their hearts racing in anticipation. The landlord's promise was comforting, but it wasn't enough to erase the lingering fear. They had no idea what the woman could do next. What lengths would she go to now that her accusations had been dismissed? Then, one afternoon, the unexpected happened. The mailman arrived at their door with an envelope, its contents not something they were prepared for. It was from their landlord. An official letter, stamped with his seal. At first, the family thought it was just a routine communication, something about an update or an upcoming inspection. But as the father of the family tore open the envelope, the color drained from his face. He didn't need to read it aloud to know that something had changed. The letter was a formal notice. The landlord had reversed his decision. He was now officially ending their lease. The reason? a matter of public concern and safety. The family's hearts sank in unison. They had been evicted. Just like that. The promises he had made, the support he had shown, all seemed meaningless now. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about a much bigger game that they hadn't seen coming. Their home, the place they had fought so hard to keep, was no longer theirs. And the worst part was, they had no idea why. The letter made no mention of the woman next door, but the family couldn't shake the feeling that she was behind this. Her threats, her persistence, it all led them to the same conclusion. The landlord had been forced into a corner, or perhaps he had simply given in. Either way, their world had just been turned upside down again, and this time, they didn't know who they could trust. They immediately called the landlord, but when he answered the phone, his voice sounded different, distant, almost as though he had been anticipating their call. "I'm sorry," he said before they could even ask. "I had to make this decision. It's out of my hands now." "Out of your hands?" the father asked, barely able to keep the desperation from his voice. "What are you talking about? You promised us. You said you'd make sure we wouldn't have to go through this." "I know," the landlord replied, his voice tight. "But there's nothing I can do anymore. The situation has escalated. The neighborhood association is involved now. They've made their decision, and I have to respect it. It's for the safety of everyone." The family's confusion deepened. Safety. What did that even mean? They hadn't caused any problems. They were just trying to live their lives. It felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them once again. They could hear the faint sound of the landlord's breath on the other end, but he didn't say anything else. "Can you at least tell us what happened?" the mother asked, her voice breaking. "Why are we being evicted? We've done nothing wrong." There was a long pause before the landlord spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't. Not right now. But I'll tell you this. You're not alone in this. Others in the neighborhood know the truth, and they're trying to help." With that, he hung up. The family stood there, staring at the phone in disbelief. They had no answers, no direction. Only more questions. They couldn't just leave. They had no place to go, no one to turn to. And yet, even as they sank into despair, a small part of them refused to accept it. Something didn't add up. The landlord had been on their side just days ago. He had been their ally. So why the sudden change? They decided they needed to find out the truth, no matter what it took. They couldn't just sit back and let the woman win. They had to take control of the situation, or they might lose everything they had worked for. But where would they start? That night, they gathered their courage and went for a walk around the neighborhood. They weren't sure what they hoped to find, but they had a feeling that they weren't the only ones who were frustrated by what was happening. It was a quiet street, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. The neighbors who had once smiled and waved seemed to avoid eye contact now. They could sense it, the coldness in the air. People were afraid. It wasn't long before they ran into someone who was willing to talk. It was an older couple, longtime residents of the neighborhood, who had seen everything that had been unfolding. They hadn't been friends with the woman who was causing all the trouble, but they knew her well enough to know that this wasn't about the family at all. "You need to understand," the older man explained, his voice low. "The woman's influence goes far beyond just this street. She's been part of the neighborhood association for years. She's got connections, and she's used them. She's always gotten her way." The family's stomachs twisted with fear. The web that the woman had woven was far larger than they had realized. This wasn't just an isolated problem. It was a battle with far-reaching consequences. The landlord, the woman added, "He's just a pawn in all of this. She's got him wrapped around her finger. He's trying to protect you, but there's not much he can do. You need to be careful. She's not going to let you walk away without a fight." The family left the conversation feeling more unsettled than ever. They had been so focused on the woman that they hadn't realized how deep her influence ran. She wasn't just a single neighbor with a grudge. She was part of a much larger, more dangerous network. The stakes had just been raised. The fight for their home was no longer just about standing up to one woman. It was about confronting an entire system that was stacked against them. And as the family made their way back home, they knew that whatever came next, they would have to be prepared for the fight of their lives. The family was at their breaking point. They had tried to stay hopeful, but the truth was sinking in. Their home, the place where they had dreamed of building a future, was slipping further away. They couldn't let the woman, or the system she was connected to, win. But what could they do? It felt like everyone had turned against them. The landlord was compromised, the neighbors were too afraid to speak up, and they were running out of time. Their eviction was final, and with every passing day, it became more real. But they refused to give up. Late one evening, the family met in secret, away from prying eyes. They had a plan, a risky one, but it was their only chance. They had learned that the neighborhood association was meeting the next day, and they had decided to confront them head-on. If they could expose the woman's influence and show the association that her actions weren't just about them, but about a larger problem, maybe they could turn the tide. As they arrived at the community center the next day, their nerves were on edge. The air was thick with tension. Neighbors milled about, some looking anxious, others pretending nothing was wrong. But they could feel the unease under the surface. The association's meeting was taking place in a small, sterile room at the back, and the family, joined by the elderly couple who had warned them, stood in the hallway, trying to steady their breath. "This is it," the elderly man whispered. "You've got to be strong. If we do this, there's no going back." They nodded. The door to the meeting room opened, and the woman appeared, walking confidently with the same haughty expression they had come to recognize. She glanced at the family briefly, but her focus was on the people inside. It was clear she was still very much in control. They had to act now or risk losing everything. The family stepped forward, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The room fell silent as soon as they entered. The association members looked up in surprise, but it didn't take long for their eyes to narrow in suspicion. They had come prepared, and they were ready to lay everything bare. "We need to talk," the father said, his voice firm, "about what's really been going on here." The woman sneered, clearly taken aback by their boldness. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, crossing her arms defensively. "This isn't your place. You've been evicted. You have no right to be here." But the family wasn't backing down. "We've been lied to, manipulated, and targeted. This isn't just about us. It's about how this entire neighborhood is being controlled by you and people like you. You've used your power to bully and intimidate us, and we're not going to let you get away with it anymore." The room was quiet for a moment as the association members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some of them clearly seemed to agree, their faces showing a hint of guilt. But others, those with ties to the woman, looked angry, as if they had been caught off guard. The woman stood straighter, her mouth opening to respond. But the elderly man spoke up first, his voice sharp with authority. "We know about your influence, about how you've used your position to intimidate others. You've been using the association to drive out anyone who doesn't fit your idea of what this neighborhood should look like. And now you're targeting a family who's done nothing but live here peacefully. But we're not going to let you keep running things like this." For a moment, the woman said nothing. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. She had always been the one in control, always the one pulling the strings. But now, for the first time, she was on the defensive. The family's words had struck a nerve, and she could no longer deny the truth. "We have evidence," the father continued, pulling out a folder filled with documents and photos. "Evidence of how you've been manipulating the landlord, getting him to evict people who don't fit your agenda. We've spoken to others in the neighborhood, people who are too afraid to speak out on their own. You've built this network of fear, and it's time for it to end." The woman's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. The room was dead silent, every pair of eyes now trained on her, waiting for her to respond. The elderly woman added, "You've bullied people into silence for too long, and we're not going to let you control this neighborhood anymore. It's time for the truth to come out." Finally, the woman spoke, but her words were laced with venom. "You think you've won," she spat. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This is bigger than you. You think you can take me down with a few papers and some half-baked accusations. You're wrong." For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. The woman was dangerous, but the family had nothing to lose. They had fought so hard to keep their home, to protect their family, and they weren't about to back down now. And then, the unexpected happened. The door to the meeting room swung open, and the landlord stepped inside, his face pale. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the family. But then his gaze shifted to the woman, and something in his expression changed. "I've seen enough," he said quietly. His voice carried weight, and everyone in the room fell silent. "I've been a fool. I should have listened to you. All of you." The family's hearts skipped a beat. The landlord, the man who had seemed so powerless, was finally taking a stand. "You're right," he said, his eyes locking with the woman's. "I've let you control things for too long. You've been using your influence to manipulate everyone, and I'm done being a part of it." The woman's face twisted with rage. "You can't do this," she screamed. "I'll make sure you regret it." But the landlord didn't flinch. "It's over," he said firmly. "You're no longer welcome here. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Your reign of terror ends now." With that, he turned to the family. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was really happening. But I'm with you now. You're staying. The lease is reinstated." The room was still, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The woman stood there, frozen, her face pale and filled with disbelief. And then, with a final glance at the family, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The family could hardly believe what had just unfolded. They had won. But just as they began to relax, to savor the victory they had fought for, something strange happened. A second letter arrived the very next day. It was from the neighborhood association. And this time, it wasn't a letter of eviction. It was a letter of thanks. The association had officially recognized the family's bravery. They had exposed the woman's abuse of power, and now the entire community was coming together to ensure something like this never happened again. But the twist came in the final paragraph. "We would like to inform you that your family is now regarded as one of the most respected members of this neighborhood. As a token of appreciation, we are offering you full ownership of your home, completely free of charge." The family was speechless. They had gone from eviction to full ownership of the property. The neighborhood had rallied around them, and the woman's reign of terror had crumbled in a way they could never have imagined. The battle had been hard, but the victory was sweeter than they had ever dreamed. The family sat in stunned silence, staring at the letter. It felt unreal, like something out of a dream. Just days ago, they had been packing their bags, trying to figure out how to start over, uncertain of where they would go or how they would rebuild. Now they were being offered full ownership of their home. It was a twist that none of them had anticipated, and for a moment they couldn't process it. But the relief soon washed over them. All the sleepless nights, all the fear, all the uncertainty, it was over. They had fought hard for what they believed in, and somehow, against all odds, they had won. Not just their home, but their dignity, their sense of justice. It was a feeling they would never forget. As they stood together, holding the letter, they couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The woman who had tried to drive them out, the landlord who had seemed powerless, the neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up. It all seemed so far away now, but they knew that this victory was more than just about them. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, pushed aside, or made to feel powerless. Their fight had shown that standing up for what's right could change the course of their lives and even an entire community. The neighbors, once hesitant and afraid to get involved, were now starting to rally around them. People who had witnessed the family's struggles, who had known what was happening but had been too intimidated to speak out, began to come forward, offering their support. Some were even offering help with repairs around the house, and others were asking how they could get involved in making sure the woman's control over the neighborhood was dismantled once and for all. The community was changing. The fear that had gripped it for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of unity. The family had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had been held hostage by one person's thirst for power. It was incredible to think how far they had come. From the brink of losing everything to standing at the center of a movement that could change the entire neighborhood's future. The elderly couple, who had played such a crucial role in guiding them, stood with them now, beaming with pride. "You did it," the elderly man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've not only saved your home, but you've changed everything." The family smiled, grateful for the support, but there was a sense of quiet reflection in their eyes. They knew that while they had won the battle, the work wasn't over. There was still more to be done. The neighborhood association had been shaken to its core, but they needed to ensure that the culture of fear and manipulation would never return. The woman's departure was only the first step. They needed to make sure the systems that allowed her to hold power over others were dismantled for good. They met with the landlord, who had truly changed his perspective. He was apologetic but determined to help. Together, they started working on creating a new neighborhood association, one that was transparent, inclusive, and focused on the well-being of all residents, not just a select few. The landlord was committed to being part of that process, and the family knew that with his support, things could finally start to change for the better. It wasn't easy. There were still some who were resistant, who didn't want to see things change. But the family's story became a powerful testament to what could happen when people stood together and fought for justice. Slowly but surely, the community began to heal. Trust had to be rebuilt, but with each passing day, it became stronger. As the weeks turned into months, the family settled back into their lives, but they knew they would never forget the experience that had brought them together. Their home, which had once felt like a battleground, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. It was a place where they could raise their children in safety, where they could finally feel secure again. And yet, even as they found peace, they knew that their story was part of something bigger. The fight for justice, for fairness, and for equality was ongoing. Their victory wasn't just about them. It was a reminder to everyone that when we stand up to injustice, we can make a difference. It wasn't always easy, and the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but they had proven that change was possible. The woman who had tried to tear them apart was gone, but her legacy remained a cautionary tale. She had shown them what could happen when one person was allowed to dominate others, when fear and manipulation were allowed to take root. But the family had also shown what could happen when people refused to give up, when they found strength in their unity and their belief in what was right. As they looked out over their neighborhood, the family knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always new battles to face, but they had learned something invaluable along the way, that even in the darkest moments, there was hope, and that hope could move mountains. In the end, it wasn't just about keeping their home. It was about standing up for what they believed in, about creating a community where everyone had a voice, and where justice wasn't something you had to fight for, but something that was freely given to everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. And as they stood there, knowing they had made a lasting impact, they couldn't help but feel proud. They had turned their pain into power, their fear into courage. They had faced the impossible and come out on top. Their journey had taught them that when we stand together, when we fight for what's right, we can change the world around us. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory of all.